Are you wondering what on earth is going on in this US election? We spoke to Ken Goldstein from ABC News.
And everyone looks at Joe Biden's lead, and you look at all the wizards saying that Joe Biden has a 90% probability of winning. And those of us in the United States look back on 2016, where those same wizards had Hillary Clinton with a 92% chance of winning. And then you folks.
Hey, it's Jonny here from CampaignForce. We inspire, train, and coach the armed forces to stand up and serve again here in the UK. On this Veterans in Politics channel, not only is it the home of the Veterans in Politics podcast, but we also delve deep into sharing tips and advice about political issues and skills that you are interested in. In this upcoming episode, we speak to ABC News pollster and elections expert Ken Goldstein, along with founder of our Friends from Veterans Campaign, Seth Lynn. So look forward for some insight into the US elections, and don't forget, hit subscribe.
The problem is I'm only interesting about 1 week every 4 years, but this just happens to be that particular week. I'm usually not this pressed, but it is great to be here. Right. So let me just share a couple thoughts with you, and happy to answer any questions. So as Jonny was saying, I have a couple different hats. I'm a professor at USF, and I work with Seth and Maddie on the Masters in Public Leadership program, which was completely 100% Seth's idea, Veterans Campaign. And then we had a crazy lunch. The next thing Seth knew, he was a professor at USF running this master's program. I also work for ABC News doing their election night work and election night calls. And then I do a lot of consulting I don't do Democrats or Republicans, but the consulting I do a little bit different than in the UK. Universities are a lot more political here in terms of at least their funding source. And so I do some strategy for universities. Let me just share just sort of like 3 minutes of thoughts on the state of the race here. And everyone looks at Joe Biden's lead, and you look at all the wizards saying that Joe Biden has a 90% probability of winning. And those of us in the United States look back on 2016, where those same wizards had Hillary Clinton with a 92% chance of winning. And then you folks in the UK remember when Brexit, right, had a 95% chance of failing. So I think everyone's got a little bit of doubt about believing what their eyes are seeing. That said, I think you'd have to have some pretty unusual connection of events for Joe Biden to lose this race. This race at the national level, even through all of the drama of the last 8 or 9 months, has been extraordinarily stable. A brief uptick for Biden last week, but since March, this has been a 7, 8, 9-point race. It continues to be a 7, 8, 9-point race. As we all know, it gets decided in the Electoral College. So some of the states in the Electoral College are a bit closer. And I have to be careful when I say this, but perhaps the best way to understand the 2020 election is that Joe Biden, Captain Obvious here, is that Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. We had an election in 2016 when you had two very unpopular candidates. Donald Trump remains underwater, both in personal favorability and in job approval. But the big difference is Joe Biden is seen as favorable by a majority of Americans. So in 2016, we had this situation where there were people who liked Clinton and hated Trump. About a third of the electorate, not shockingly, they voted for Clinton. About a third of the electorate liked Trump and hated Clinton. Not shockingly, they voted for Trump. But we also had 1 in 5 Americans, 1 in 5 voters who disliked both candidates. And you would expect them either to not vote, to vote for a third party candidate, or to break evenly. And instead, they broke overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. So that's a big difference in this election. So for Trump to win, you'd have to see probably 4 things happen. His job approval would need to go up. Joe Biden's favorability would need to go down. You would have to see massive turnout. And actually, I do follow your elections a little bit. There were many more non-college educated whites than people realized in the United Kingdom in the last election. So there'd have to be huge turnout of non-college educated whites in this country. And then there would have to be some significant election administration issues. And I'm not necessarily talking about anything nefarious, but just even when things are going right and there's no machinations, vote by mail tends to be less efficient and more votes get thrown out.
And that, well, what can I say? That is an absolutely awesome analysis. For those of us that are political geeks over here in the UK, then absolutely we do look across the pond and seeing what's going on. And most of us are clueless. So to have that kind of level of analysis is really cool.
So listen, I'm sure you're all familiar with President Trump's comments, who called all of you suckers and losers for all of the service that you did on behalf of your countries. That has certainly been picked up by some veterans. That's certainly been picked up by some organizations, and we work with Democrats and Republicans. But friends of Seth from the Naval Academy and other ones who are working more on the Democratic side are pushing that message out in a very directed way to veterans. That said, and it's one thing that Seth and I want to do, and as I think about things we could do together, there actually is not a lot of good systematic polling research on veterans. And when there is, and Jeremy could probably speak to this much better than I can. Sometimes, so there's this one survey that comes out, and when you look at the fine print, it's like only older officers who are subscribing to a particular newspaper, right? So that's obviously not consistent with everybody. Or it'll be a decent sample, but it's completely out of context. And it'll say, this is how veterans differ from the general population, when veterans in the United States are obviously not a monolith, but tend to be more male, tend to be not college educated, tend to be from the south of the country. I mean, I'm making broad generalizations here. And so when you compare veterans to other people who are like them, the differences may not be as profound than when you're just taking that slice because you're not accounting for the selection effect. But Jeremy and Seth know a lot more about that. My only secret mission there is I'm on the committee that, and we're recorded, so don't tell on me. I'm on the committee that writes the exit poll for the networks. And I always have a temper tantrum if they don't throw the veteran question on, because the challenge is there's a fairly low, and it's probably even lower in the UK, the incidence of veterans. I mean, what percent of people in the United Kingdom have served in the military?
It's about 4%, so 2.6 million veterans. That's going to drop by 1 million by 2028 as our national service generation from the 50s and 60s die off. So just 1.6 million. So it's going to drop to about 3% of the population.
Right. So, so even just from a, incidence level of when you're doing a survey, if you're just doing a normal survey of 1,000 or 2,000 people, you don't have enough veterans in your sample to say anything. So one of the good things about the exit polls, you have these massive sample sizes, so you can get a fair number of veterans.
That's absolutely awesome to get that insight on the veterans question, because it's certainly something as our veteran generation try and find an identity, particularly the post-Iraq Afghan generation. There's a bit of a division between, say, I'm going to say it, my generation that served in those conflicts, to perhaps the Northern Ireland Cold War generation. I mean, I served in Northern Ireland as well, so I kind of got feet in both camps. But certainly in terms of that generational split and some of those views, reading certain papers, being of a certain age, I think we're seeing some of that being played out in our country at the moment. And whether or not that translates into votes is a really interesting question. Not that we very rarely talk about party politics in CampaignForce, so or make those assessments. So it's really fascinating to hear about your view from your side.
So listen, I think China is a very interesting issue. Donald Trump's rhetoric on China has been very hot, and what he has done in terms of some immigration policy and what he has done in terms of pressure on college campuses in dealing with China. And listen, like the United Kingdom, you know who's subsidizing all your universities in the United Kingdom? The same folks who are subsidizing universities in the United States. And Trump's rhetoric and policies on that have been very strong. That said, Nancy Pelosi is no friend of the Chinese, and the Democratic leadership in Congress are absolutely no friend of the Chinese. So you're going to see a lot of zags if Joe Biden becomes president. China may be one where the rhetoric softens, but you may not see a significant difference. I mean, the other thing I would just say anecdotally, and you know, I owe this to people I've met through Seth. You know, you can't peg down what Seth is, right? But he's got tons of friends who are Democrats and Republicans. Even his Democratic friends who are very active in Democratic politics and are no fans of Donald Trump, when I talk to them about China, they get pissed off about China and tell stories of, you know, they're flying in the straits and how irresponsible they think China is in the straits. And even very Democratic US Navy folks will get awfully fired up about the Chinese.
That's really fascinating. Those kind of issues that transcend political divides. Obviously, we've seen that played out in the Brexit campaign with splits within different party affiliations. MPs from different parties collaborating on votes to bring down the government or to try and reverse Brexit policy. That's probably been one of the issues most recently that has been, and we're starting to see a little bit of that during COVID-19 too, with some pretty independent voices, not necessarily sticking to party lines. So it's interesting to hear about China. Ken, we'll let you go. That's been absolutely amazing. Because I realised that you've got the day job to do, as it were, and I hope that this is the start of a really good collaboration between our two organisations.
As far as the issue of Trump and veterans, I'll be honest. I think it really comes down to where you stand before he made the comments, whether you are is making a difference or not. You know, I think that people, you know, I would disagree with the premise that his rhetoric has gotten more negative on veterans than I said, because I think that as controversial as the comments were about suckers and losers, I think that those were comments that were it was not that everybody agreed that it actually happened. Whereas 4 years ago, everybody saw what he said about John McCain, about, you know, being, I like the heroes that weren't captured. And I don't think that it's gotten necessarily worse. How it may actually affect the election, I would say probably little to none, because people are generally pretty entrenched in their own positions right now. And I speak to a lot of veterans on both sides of the aisle, and the impression I've gotten from the people who were to the left of center is they're really fired. They were at least really fired up about those comments up until the next thing that Trump said 2 days later, which made them forget all about those comments and be really, really angry about the comments he made 5 minutes ago, which seems to be a pattern. I don't know if it's been going on for 4 years like that. On the right, I think that people were like, did he really say that? Was that really how it came out? You know, it sounds like something he would say, but not really. I mean, usually he just says these kind of things to people who have, you know, somehow upset him. And I don't see how the people who, you know, fought 100 years ago would have upset him the same way that John McCain did. So it just didn't just quite. They just were like, well, I'll wait till, you know, reserve judgment until I hear more. As Ken mentioned, there are some groups that are of left and center veterans that are amplifying those comments and using them as to build narrative. I personally, I'm not sure about this, but I personally say it's probably not going to be terribly effective, because talking about how much of an immoral jerk Trump is not generally effective, because people generally have that notion already set, and there are plenty of people, as Ken was mentioning, who think that the president is not a good president and is immoral, and yet are still going to vote for him. So telling them that he's immoral again is not going to have any effect. And I think there are much more effective messages, and it's a zero-sum game, right? I mean, you only have the average American voters going to pay attention for 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 or 6 minutes this year because it's 2020. And so, the 30 seconds you talk about something they already know, or 30 seconds you could spend on something else. That's my general view of the situation.
But one thing we haven't really found out or started to explore in this country is why veterans run for office, which seems like probably a good moment to bring in Jeremy. At this stage, normally when you're doing these interviews, you'd start, talking about how you've read their book and things. I haven't done any of that. I'll just be lying. So I'm not going to try and BS you, Jeremy. But Jeremy is the author of an amazing book called Why Veterans Run, available from all good bookstores, Amazon Prime, etc. There you go. There's a copy of it. Definitely on the reading list. But Jeremy, do you want to tell us a bit of an insight of why do veterans run?
Great to be with everyone. I will, with a little bit of humility and sheepishness, one of the reviews of my book correctly points out that I never really answer the question in the book. It's clear that there are, both, Seth and Ken mentioned, times when the United States had a lot of veterans in politics. And so, implied in that idea is that there's something about our electoral politics that either attracts veterans, or there's something about veterans that, propels them, towards politics. Or it's a combination of both the case. And a lot of people lament the sheer drop off of the number of veterans that was, somewhere around 60-70% of Congress at some point in the 70s. And now it's a much lower number. But I like to remind anyone who will listen that they're still numerically overrepresented in politics. In other words, if we just chose people at random, we'd have fewer veterans in politics than if we go through an electoral system. And it's what's interesting to me is trying to find exactly where or try to quantify exactly where the veteran advantage, whether it's a push factor or a pull factor, happens. And to begin to answer the question of why there are so many military veterans who have run for president, my book is centrally on presidential elections, but it does touch on congressional and lower ballot contests. But the book would be very short if the answer were veterans get more votes on election day, because that's just an empirical test we can run, right? We can just see, do veterans collect some 2, 3, 4, 5 point advantage, other things being equal. And if that were the case, the Republicans and the Democrats would never nominate a non-veteran. If there was some quantitative example of a clear veteran advantage that parties enjoyed across the board, we'd have 535 veterans on Capitol Hill. So what I found quantitatively looking at half century of presidential elections and about a decade of congressional elections is there's no systematic advantage for veterans in the general election in November. And Seth and I have talked about this many times, many conversations, of trying to find that there's probably in the sort of black box that we can't see those local party politics, local political actors, small time, just city and regional and almost neighborhood politics that feels like veterans should be advantaged, and so they start preferring them at those earlier stages for local state legislative races or local mayoral contests, and that somewhere in the early pipeline there's an advantage in fundraising, an advantage that party elites sort of point to, in addition to what we suspect is a motivation issue too. The kinds of people, especially among the officer corps, the kind of people that wanted to self-select into our entirely voluntary based professional military, seems to be correlated with an urge to try to help out in lead in political life when they get back home. So there's lots of facets of this. I feel the need also to come back to the question that both Ken and Seth touched on with President Trump and veterans. Is they kind of talk about veterans in the electorate as potential voters. I want to add another angle, which is that the president, clearly wanted to wrap himself in some kind of a military mantle, symbolically naming, quote unquote, his generals into, very important positions in the cabinet, chief of staff with, people like John Kelly and Jim Mattis. And I tweeted at the time and stand by it is, Donald Trump hates experts, and generals are by definition experts, and that relationship was never going to work. And it didn't. And so whether we're looking at, Donald Trump's relationship with the Gold Star families, or, those controversial comments that he may or may not have made, or you rewind the clock all the way back to 2015 when he talked about John McCain, this is an individual that just doesn't know how to interact and speak in that sort of more selfless language that people with military experience can speak.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I just jump on that, Johnny? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's quite opportune, actually, that I have a picture on my wall called Fixing Intel, which is the official kind of portrait of the Afghan campaign from the intelligence corps, signed by a certain Michael Flynn, with a personal message, a very limited edition print. Thank you for listening to Veterans in Politics, brought to you by CampaignForce. I've been your host, Jonny Ball, and I'd like to express a special thanks to our friends from Veterans Campaign over in the US to bring to you this US election special. Particular thanks to Seth Lynn, Ken Goldstein, and Jeremy Teigen. And please don't forget to subscribe to this channel.